Hello, my name is Paddy, and welcome to the 10th episode of my podcast, Fighting Cashflow. I'm recording this video on the first week of January, and I hope that each and every one of you had a very safe and happy holiday season with family and loved ones, and I wish you all the joy and prosperity that 2026 can bring. In this episode, I'm going to do a recap of the 9 episodes that I did last year, but more so than acting as a recap on 2025, this episode will act as my predictions for 2026 and beyond, because a lot of what I spoke about in my episodes last year hasn't come to fruition yet. And despite people thinking that if you make a prediction on the economy that doesn't happen before the end of the year, that means that you're wrong, but that's not really how investing works. And that'll be more of a case of trying to time the market. But in investing, all we can hope is that our portfolio has performed as well as we possibly could have planned for over the last 12 months, as well as ensuring that we are positioned as best as we possibly can be for the 12 months that are oncoming. And on that note, I still stand behind everything that I said in all of the episodes throughout 2025. And I'm still adamant that I'm focused on some of the biggest macroeconomic themes that are playing out in our Canadian as well as our global economies. And at the end of this episode, I'll go through how my portfolio did throughout 2025 and how I'm positioned for the year ahead. So, on that note, let's get into the recap of 2025's episodes. In episode 1 of this podcast, we learned how to calculate the cash flow of a residential real estate property here in Canada. The cash flow of an investment property is the rental income after tax minus the total carrying cost, and this then will give us our cash flow. In this episode, we went through how to calculate the residential property tax as well as your rental income tax, and we place specific attention on your rental income tax write-offs, the most substantial of which is your ability to write off the interest portion of your mortgage against your rental income tax. Because the interest portion of the mortgage can be so substantial here in the Lower Mainland, this often results in landlords paying $0 in rental income tax. We also looked at how to calculate the CMHC insurance, as well as the minimum down payment requirements, which have changed in recent years. But more specifically, what we're looking at is the cash flow of these pre-construction one-bed apartments that would have been sold at peak pricing here in the Lower Mainland back in 2021 and 2022. And as there is commonly 4 to 5 years between the selling of these pre-construction units and the completion of these units, it is this year in 2026 that the majority of these units which were sold at peak pricing will be coming to completion. In order to account for the average priced pre-construction one-bed unit that was being sold here in the Lower Mainland, we considered a price of $770,000. This would be the cost of a 550 square foot apartment being sold at $1,400 per square foot. And I know that $1,400 per square foot was the average price for these pre-sale one-bed apartments here in the Lower Mainland, as I personally drove around to collect pricing from each of these presentation centres. This pricing wasn't available online and usually not available over the phone. It was only available by visiting the presentation centres and getting a piece of paper from the realtor who was working there. And I mainly focused on the suburbs outside of the city of Vancouver. Suburbs such as Burnaby, Burquitlam, Metrotown, and the suburb which is the most overbuilt in my opinion, which is Surrey Central. I then calculated the future cash flow of each of these pre-construction apartments using the rents outlined at the top of the screen. And I had mentioned in that episode that average asking rents in Vancouver had already begun to decline. And it has been one of the core themes of this podcast that I believe rents will continue to decline, with a combination of record supply coming to the market, combined with our now zero population growth, which will result in very low demand. And falling rents here in Canada is now something that even the mainstream media is starting to cover, with rents here in Vancouver being around 6.6% alone in 2025. And then we dove down deeper into the math that is required to calculate monthly mortgage payments. And this allowed us to graph out the amount of your monthly mortgage payment that will go towards principal or interest for every single mortgage payment that you'll make throughout the entire life of the mortgage. As you can see, you'll pay the least amount of principal in your very first mortgage payment, and you'll pay more and more principal with every mortgage payment after that, until your very final mortgage payment, which is almost all principal. Inversely, you will pay the most amount of interest in your very first mortgage payment, and you pay less and less interest in every mortgage payment after that until your very last mortgage payment, which will essentially contain almost zero interest. And we calculated that at an interest rate of 2.775%, the amount of principal and interest in your very first mortgage payment will almost be exactly the same. And at interest rates above 2.775%, you'll be paying more interest in principal in your first mortgage payments. And at an interest rate of less than 2.775%, you'll be paying less interest in principal in every single mortgage payment. We then calculated a cash flow of apartments of varying prices and then graphed out this data. And we can see that there's a vertex or bend in the line. And this occurs at the point where you are no longer paying any rental income tax on your investment property. And this is due to the amount of interest that you're paying in each monthly mortgage payment, which can be written off against rental income tax. Finally, we use an interest rate of 3.5%. And we chose 3.5% because the Bank of Canada's stated neutral rate at the time was in the range of 2% to 2.5%. And I believe that this would lead to a variable rate mortgage here in Canada of roughly 3.5%. And now, fast forward on to today, the Bank of Canada's overnight rate is right in the middle of that range at 2.25%, which is currently leading to variable rate mortgages of 3.6% here in British Columbia. And I'd also mentioned at that time in the podcast that I believe that variable rate mortgages would be cheaper than fixed rate mortgages due to us getting back to a normal shaped yield curve. At the time of making the podcast, our yield curve was inverted, which resulted in the variable rates being higher than fixed rates, which isn't common at all. And I said at the time that we would delve much deeper into the difference between variable rate and fixed rate mortgages in a future episode, and I still absolutely plan on doing that. There is so much more to cover and discuss when it comes to understanding mortgage rates and how they are tied to the overnight rate from the Bank of Canada, as well as Canadian bond yields. In episode 2, we looked at the amount of housing starts and housing completions, as well as the amount of housing under construction in any given year in Canada going back to the mid-1950s. And I was very surprised to see that our record for unit completions or home completions here in Canada was a 50-year-old record, set in 1974. The peak in starts in that cycle was the year before, in 1973. And the reason that there was a 1-year lag between the peak in starts and the peak in completions in that cycle is due to what we were building and how long it was taking to build it. And the most popular housing unit type in Canada by far at that time was single-family homes. We then looked at how there is a very understandable correlation between starts and completions, and we observed how starts always precede completions. This is quite easy to understand, as any unit which is coming to completion soon is a unit which was started in years prior. And with this in mind, we predicted that we were going to break our all-time record for unit completions here in Canada in 2025 and perhaps again in 2026. And this is based on the record amount of unit starts that we had in Canada in 2021 and 2022. And the reason that there's now roughly a 4-year lag time between the starts and the completions is once again down to what we're building and how long it's taken to build them. And the most popular housing unit type that's being built in Canada currently is apartments and condos. In fact, this decade so far, the 2020s, is the first decade ever in which Canada is building more apartments and condos than all other housing unit types combined. We then went on to make the correlation between unit starts and therefore unit completions or new home supply here in Canada to interest rates. It has been the primary theme of this podcast so far that everything in our economy is tied to interest rates. And this is something that we'll continue to see as we go through the other 8 episodes that I did throughout 2025. We then looked at unit starts by housing unit type, and we can see that the construction of single-family homes is at multi-decade lows here in Canada. The year of record low single-family home starts was in 1982, but this was a singular year with robust years on either side of it, where now we have back-to-back years of record low single-family home starts here in this country. And I believe that this will create an even more dire shortage of this home type in the future here in Canada. And that's a real shame, because the dream of owning a single-family home, of having your own driveway and backyard, is a dream that seems to be dying here in Canada currently. Despite this, our second and fourth highest years for overall unit starts was in 2021 and 2022. And this has been solely driven by a massive surge in the construction of condos and apartments. And this has led to the amount of apartments and condos under construction across Canada being at levels that we have simply never seen before. We will speak about this again later on in the podcast, as I believe that the huge amount of apartments and condos that are coming to completion over the next few years is just one of the factors that I believe will cause a massive imbalance between supply and demand for that product type. Next, in episode 3, we looked at the CAPE ratio of the S&P 500, or the cyclically adjusted price-to-earnings ratio by Nobel Prize-winning economist Robert Shiller. And we looked at how the CAPE ratio is currently at its second highest level of all times. We then looked at the other periods in time in which CAPE ratio was extremely elevated. The third highest level for the CAPE ratio was in 1929, at the very end of the Roaring Twenties. And the highest ever level for the CAPE ratio was in 1999, at the end of the dot-com boom. And we then studied the history of these past periods of time to see if there was any similarities between then and what we're experiencing today. And the major similarity, the thing that has always led to overvaluation in equity markets, is the introduction of new technologies. In the 1920s, the automobile was becoming very popular in America, and this completely revolutionized how companies were able to transport goods and services around the country. Other new technologies which transformed the way that we deliver goods and services around our countries, such as the invention of the canals and the invention of the railroads, also led to equity bubbles which eventually ended up crashing. The main producer of the automobiles at this time, the Ford Motor Company, introduced the moving assembly line into production of its vehicles. This is a technology which is still extremely prominent today. In fact, the moving assembly line was so revolutionary that it allowed Ford to cut the cost of production of the Model T car by 60% between the 1910s and the 1920s. It was so transformational that workers were concerned that there'd be mass layoffs at that time, as so many people in America worked in manufacturing, and the worry was that people's jobs would be replaced by robots. This is a worry that we also have today, where we worry that the introduction of AI will result in a much higher unemployment rate going forward. The radio was also becoming very popular in the 1920s, and this completely transformed how companies were able to advertise their goods and services to their customers. Despite this, the RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, lost over 90% of its value in the 1920s crash. But with all these new technologies throughout the 1920s, with the automobile and the moving assembly line and the radio, investors got so overly excited about the future earnings potential of these companies that they started to borrow money in order to buy equities. And this is once again a tactic that has become extremely popular in recent years, where equity markets have been producing lofty returns and where money could have been borrowed at very low rates. In the 1990s, we had the introduction of the internet. Once again, a technology that completely transformed how companies interacted with their customers and how customers interacted with companies. And many extremely large and profitable US companies, such as Microsoft, Cisco, Intel, and IBM, lost over 80% of their share price when the tech bubble burst. The darling of the internet revolution, Amazon, saw their share price go up 15-fold between 1998 and 1999. But they gave back all of these gains after the bubble burst, and they lost over 95% of their share value. And now, since the introduction of ChatGPT in November of 2022, over 3 years ago, the S&P 500 has almost doubled in value. The reason that these bubbles are created is because investors look at these new technologies and become too overly optimistic with the future earnings potential of these companies that will be using these technologies. But I'm a huge believer in the fact that the collective earnings of these companies needs to be offset by the collective spending power of us as their consumer base. And I'm extremely worried that the spending power of the collective consumer base, our spending power, simply cannot keep up with the earnings expectations that have been placed on these companies. I would strongly recommend going back and looking at this episode on the CAPE ratio for other important pieces of information regarding today's equity markets, such as the fact that American households now have a larger percentage of their net worth invested in the stock market than they ever have before, with over 45% of the household financial asset mix now been invested in equities according to the Fed Flow Funds data. This is substantially higher than the 41% which was reached in 1999. Also, the fact that now over half of the S&P 500 is passively managed through vehicles such as ETFs has me extremely worried. And if I were to predict that the S&P 500 could crash by over 50% from where it is currently, all I'm really predicting is that what happened in these past periods of time where the CAPE ratio was this elevated happens again today. Then, because we've been evaluating the S&P 500 based on its price-to-earnings ratio, in episode 4, we went on to explain the significance of price-to-earnings ratios. Essentially, price-to-earnings ratios are important because the inverse of the price-to-earnings ratio, the E over P, is the earnings yield. This is the earnings per share for a company divided by the share price for that company. And why a multiple or a P/E ratio of 18 to 20 is significant is because if the P/E ratio is 20, the E over P or the earnings yield is 5%. And this earnings yield competes directly with the yield or the interest rate that we can get if we were to buy a risk-free asset such as the US 10-year Treasury yield. Also note that the US 10-year Treasury yield has only come down by 15 basis points since we did this episode in the summer. And this is despite the US Federal Reserve having cut rates by 5 times that, by 75 basis points or 0.75%. So why have US Treasury yields not come down further, despite the fact that the Federal Reserve have been cutting rates fairly consistently in the second half of 2025? Well, from episode 5 we know that the Fed funds rate is one of the components which makes up US Treasury yields. But there are other components also, mainly future inflation expectations. When we're investing in the bond market, essentially what we're doing is we're loaning out money that will be paid back to us at some point in the future. And if future inflation expectations were to rise, the value of the money that will be paid back at that point in the future will be worth less because of inflation. So we aren't just buying US Treasury yields based on current inflation and based on the current Fed funds rate. Rather, we're buying them based on the future or longer term expectations for both of these metrics. This is how the US 10-year Treasury yield, as well as other bond yields, are priced. We then went on to look at Tesla's PE ratio and earnings yield. And at first glance, these figures don't seem to make any sense at all. And that is because Tesla is absolutely not priced based on its current earnings. The valuation of Tesla is based on them earning far more at some point in the future. In fact, Tesla's earnings would have to be 15 times greater than what they are today in order to justify today's valuation. And we then went on to calculate how quickly Tesla's earnings would need to grow each year for different periods of time in order to justify the valuation that they've already achieved today. It's also worth noting, for reasons that I can't understand, that Tesla is now valued far more highly than it was in the summer, despite the fact that their car sales are continuing to decline. But that's enough about Tesla. And now let's get back to macroeconomics and things that are more important to our economy overall. And on that note, episode 5 was solely based on the most important sector of our global financial system, which are the bond markets. We looked in detail into each of the components that make up bond yields, and we strive to understand the bond market more deeply by looking at a transaction in the bond market from the point of view of the buyer. Putting myself in the shoes of any person or entity in a transaction is a method I've used for quite a while to more deeply understand transactions in business or transactions across your economy. We went on to discuss all of the various concepts, such as risk premium, and we looked at the relationship between the price of a bond and the yield of a bond. And then I went on to explain why I believe that the bond markets are so important. Essentially, it is because bond yields determine the cost of money. As Ray Dalio would point out, the vast majority of spending in the US is by credit, and not with the use of actual hard cash. And when Treasury and bond yields rise, this raises the cost of credit. In other words, it raises the cost of borrowing money. And it does this for everybody, for governments, for companies and corporations, and for households when they're purchasing items with credit, such as buying a house with a mortgage, a car with a car loan, or buying things with a credit card. And because rising bond yields increase the cost of borrowing and therefore increase the cost of spending, rising bond yields squeeze the amount of spending that we have in our economy. And this is why periods in time in which bond yields have risen are then shortly followed by times in our economy where we've less spending. And this typically will then go on to cause a contraction in our economy, which is also known as a recession. In this video, How the Economic Machine Works by Ray Dalio, Ray explains that how it is the credit in our economy that causes us to have cycles. In order to gain this knowledge, Ray has studied 500 years of European empires, as well as 2,000 years of Chinese dynasties. And Ray has published several books on the cycles that he has continually observed to happen throughout history. Ray would say that our economy is constantly going through these cycles. In fact, Ray has often said, by looking at our current economic situation, that he feels like he's watching a movie that he's seen before, with the only exception that the characters are wearing different clothes and using different technologies. Ray has often credited this understanding of the economy to what has allowed him to become a multi-billionaire and one of the best-known investors of our generation. And the reason that I follow Ray's work so closely is because it matches up so well with this chart that I've used for many years now to describe where I think that we are in this current economic cycle. Since I first started studying economics, I've always believed that our economy is constantly going through these cycles. And Ray Dalio would state that it is the rising of interest rates that signal the start of the end of the short-term debt cycle. And this matches up perfectly with what we're looking at in this chart here, where all of the recessions that we're looking at going back to the mid-1950s have always occurred after there's been a substantial increase in interest rates, and normally the recession doesn't happen until rates have peaked, and oftentimes doesn't occur until they've started to come back down again. So then, when we have come through a rate hiking cycle, like we just have, i.e. when we get close to the end of the debt cycle, we need to watch out for over-levered parts of our economy, areas where the math simply doesn't work anymore. First, let's look at the rate hiking cycle of the late 1980s. This is the rate hiking cycle that led to the 1990 recession and caused the most recent substantial decline in Canadian home prices, with home prices in Canada peaking in 1989 and not getting back to those prices in real terms, meaning adjusted for inflation, until 2003. Next, we look at the rate hiking cycle of the late 1990s. This was the rate hiking cycle which popped the dot-com bubble, which we've already spoken about. Next, we'll look at the rate hacking cycle of the mid-2000s. This was a rate hacking cycle that led to the 2008 Great Recession and led to housing market crashes in countries like the US and in my home country, Ireland. Home prices in Ireland fell by over 50% at this time and didn't regain their 2008 highs until 2022, 14 years later, which was the same amount of time it took Canadian home prices to recover in real terms after the 1990 crash. Next was the COVID recession, but I genuinely feel as though we should disregard this technical recession because the contraction in economic activity at this time didn't occur because we were at the end of a short-term debt cycle. It declined because our economy was being physically shut down due to the pandemic. And then when the US Federal Reserve as well as other central banks responded by bringing rates to zero, not only did our global economy quickly recover, but economic activity exploded due to zero interest rates. This led to a huge surge in demand across all sectors in our economy, which caused a huge imbalance between supply and demand across the market, which eventually led to inflation. And then we come to our most recent rate hacking cycle, which has been the largest relative increase in interest rates going back to the 1970s, which is when our global economy experienced its last substantial bout of inflation. And now we need to ask ourselves, which parts of our economy went into the end of this rate hacking cycle in an over-leveraged situation, where the math and fundamentals simply don't work anymore. And we've already mentioned how the fundamentals of the S&P 500, i.e. the price-earnings ratio of the S&P 500, suggests that this equity market is extremely overvalued going into the end of this short-term debt cycle. As well as this, I believe the fundamentals of the real estate market in our major cities in Canada of Toronto and Vancouver, i.e. the average home price to average household income in these markets, suggests that these markets are also going into the end of this short-term debt cycle in an over-leveraged and overvalued position. And in episode 6, we looked at the Toronto pre-construction condo market, which I believe is the epicenter of the Canadian housing bubble and the point at which I believe this bubble would eventually pop. And we can see that the sales of condos in this market have already fallen off a cliff ever since rates begun to rise. And this is coinciding with record years of supply. But the math gets worse. These condos that are completing in 2025 and 2026 were sold at peak pricing in 2021 and 2022, and back in 2021 and 2022. These pre-sale condos were selling at a 40% premium to resale condos, to other completed and existing condos on the market. With condo prices in Toronto going up 22.5% in 2021 alone, it was easy for people to imagine that prices would go up by another 40% over the next 4 years, the time it would take to complete the condos that they were buying at that time. But not only have the prices of resale condos not gone up by 40% over the last few years, but they've actually come down by 18%, with price declines accelerating in recent months. And then we must consider that a substantial amount of these condos, which are completing last year and this year, are still unsold because developers only needed to sell 70% of the building in order to get construction financing from the bank. And where historically it would have been common to sell out the entire building upon the launch of the presentation centre, in 2021, prices were going up at a clip of 22.5% per year. It simply didn't make sense to sell product which you didn't need to sell, which might be worth 10% more in 6 months or perhaps 20% more in another 12 months. But then, as soon as rates began to rise, demand for these pre-sale condos plummeted. And Urban Nation states that there could be as many as 23,000 unsold condos in the construction pipeline in Toronto. And this number has been elevated for a while. But these unsold condos don't become a problem until they're completed. And with every month that passes, this glut of unsold condos is coming ever closer to completion and is going to be met with record low demand. And to try and gauge where demand may go from here, let us put ourselves in the shoes of a potential buyer in this market. And let's consider that if we were to buy one of these new pre-construction condos that are now coming to completion or at completion, we'd be choosing to pay a 40% premium over other completed and relatively new condos on the market. And if we were to buy with the plan of waiting it out until prices went back up again, we'd be taking on a negative cash flow of over $1,000 a month if we were intending to buy this apartment as an investor with the intent to rent it out. And this negative cash flow is likely to get worse, as rents are now coming down substantially in our major cities of Toronto and Vancouver. And I believe that rents will absolutely come down even more, with a record amount of purpose-built rentals under construction across our country. And this product is completely separate to the investor condos which were built to sell, which we looked at in this episode. And this is coupled with declining population, which is completely uncharted territory for Canada. And we're very likely only at the beginning of this downturn in the rental market, because we're only at the beginning of this period of time where we're due to experience zero population growth. And it wasn't until we were at the end of the period of record population growth where we experienced the peak in the average asking rents in the rental market. And since we did this episode on the Toronto condo market, demand has fallen even further, with recent reports showing only a few dozen new condo sales in Toronto over the last few months. And from looking at this market from the perspective of a potential buyer, I find it very hard to see how demand will come back anytime soon. Next, in episode 7, we looked at population growth in Canada, because population growth has massive implications on a country's economy. And in Canada, we've just experienced the largest swings in population growth that we've ever experienced, and in my opinion, the largest swings that we're likely to see long into the foreseeable future. We looked at the various components of population growth, such as the births and deaths, and we can see that the amount of births in Canada has remained range-bound over the last 50 years, while the amount of deaths in our country has more than doubled over that same time period. And we're on track for the amount of deaths to surpass the amount of births that we have in this country each year in the coming few years. And even though the amount of births in Canada has remained range-bound since the early 70s, the birth rate over this time period has declined substantially. We're having a similar amount of babies in the country as we did in the early 70s, despite the fact that the population of Canada has almost doubled over that period of time. And it is because of that doubling of population over the last 55 years that has resulted in the amount of deaths that we have each year being double what it was in the early 1970s, despite the death rate remaining stable. We then looked at the immigration stats in Canada. An immigrant, in accordance with StatsCan, is someone who comes to Canada who already has permanent resident status. And we can see that the amount of immigrants coming to Canada over the last few years was almost double the long-term average. But the real source of the explosion in the population growth in Canada over the last few years came from the non-permanent resident sector. These are international students, temporary foreign workers, and asylum seekers. I myself was one of these newcomers to Canada back in 2015, and I am extremely grateful that my future in Canada is secure, because for a lot of people who came to Canada over the last few years, people who were promised the opportunity to build a future for themselves here in Canada, will be forced to leave over the coming 2 years, and we've already started to see this happen. These are the people who will be the real victims of our government's reckless and thoughtless immigration policy over the last few years. And then, by putting the various components of population growth together, we get the total population growth in Canada each year for the last 55 years. And we can see that we've come through 3 years of massive population growth in Canada, where the average population growth between 2022 and 2024 was over 3 times the long-term average. It was this surge in population growth that caused a severe housing shortage here in Canada. We've already seen from earlier on in this episode that we're only ever able to build about 250,000 homes in any given year here in Canada, going back over the last 50 years. So, with our ability to bring about 250,000 homes to completion each year, combined with an average population growth of 1 million people coming to the country each year between 2022 and 2024, the math just simply didn't work. We were bringing all these people to our country with no place to house them. Also, I believe it was this massive surge in population growth that has helped keep Canada's GDP in positive territory over the last few years, because Canada's GDP per capita has been in recessionary territory over those 3 years of massive population growth. And I believe that it was the substantial increasing of Canada's population during that time that was one of the main factors that kept our overall GDP in positive territory. But now all this has changed, and since recording this episode, our population growth has now become a population decline. And despite the mainstream media here in Canada trying to sell this as new news in recent times, this shouldn't come as any surprise to anybody who's been closely following our economy, because it's almost been 2 years since the government came out with their plan to reduce the amount of non-PR residents in our country from 7% down to 5%. And even though this may seem like a small change, essentially what this meant was reducing our population to 0 or a negative number for the remainder of this year and next. And where we have already seen the implications of having massive population growth in an economy, I believe that we're soon about to see the results of having a sustained period of 0 population growth. I will continue to follow our government's immigration policy closely, because I find it very hard to believe that they will continue to keep population growth at near 0 or in negative territory for the remainder of the next 2 years. In fact, I believe that by the end of next year, or sometime shortly after, that the government of Canada will try to invite these newcomers to our country once again. But I'm not quite sure the prospect of chasing the Canadian dream will seem as lucrative to these people as the dream that was sold to them in recent years. Next, in episode 8, we looked at G7 government debt levels, and specifically the interest rate that these G7 governments now need to pay on their debt. The interest rate that these G7 governments need to pay on their debt is represented by the treasury and bond yields of these countries. This is the yield that we as investors would get if we were to loan our money out to these countries. But inversely, this yield is the interest rate that these companies therefore need to pay when issuing new debt or refinancing old debt. And we looked at how these interest rates across all of these G7 nations are at some of the highest levels that we've seen this century so far. We then looked at each component of these treasury yields and government bond yields, and how each of these components individually may have contributed to a higher treasury and bond yield overall. We then considered if a risk premium might be started to be included in these treasury yields. Treasury and government bond yields typically don't contain a risk premium, but investors may now be beginning to doubt that loaning out money to the US government may not be as much of a risk-free investment as they once thought it was. This would be because the US government debt is continuing to balloon out, and this is despite the cost-cutting attempts from Doge around this time last year. And the US government is consistently spending more each year than it brings in tax revenues, with US government expenditure being 40% more than what it brings in revenue in 2024 alone. This is causing the US government to have to issue more and more debt. And Ray Dalio is worried that there will be an imbalance between the supply and demand for this debt in the coming years. And Ray is worried that even if the demand for this debt were to remain strong, that it simply won't keep up in the increase of supply of this debt. We then looked at how all of these markets are interlinked and how a change in yields in one market can go on to cause a change in yields in all other markets also. And then we looked at a real-life example of this, when we looked at how a peak in the US Treasury yield in October of 2023 caused a spike in the bond yields of all other G7 nations at this time also. This is because all of these governments compete for the same pool of investors to buy their debt. In other words, all of these countries are competing for the same pool of investors to choose their country when choosing whom they loan out their money to. We saw a spike in the Canada 30-year bond yield at this time also, as well as it being in the same month in October of 2023 where we saw the peak in the Canada 5-year bond yield. This is what caused the 5-year fixed mortgage rates here in Canada to also peak at this time, a month later in November of 2023. This is once again an example how increased treasury yields and government bond yields increase the cost of borrowing and therefore increase the cost of spending for everybody, from governments to households and everybody in between. There is also a peak in the Japan 30-year bond yield at this time also. But notice how yields in Japan have more than doubled since then. And I'd like to spend an entire episode focusing on Japanese treasury yields, because the ultra-low rates that Japan has experienced for many decades now has really increased the popularity of the yen carry trade. The yen carry trade was a strategy where investors borrowed money in Japan in Japanese yen, and then invested that borrowed money abroad in higher yielding assets, such as US equities. But then, as borrowing costs in Japan have risen, combined with lowering in the return that these investors are getting in the assets abroad, such as US equities, this causes these borrowers to be squeezed, as the spread between the rate at which they're borrowing at versus the rate of return that they're making their investments abroad is diminished and may even find itself in negative territory at some point in the future. Finally, I finished off episode 8 by explaining why it is that I'm concerned with rising treasury yields and government bond yields. And it is because rising US Treasury yields raises the cost of borrowing and then therefore raises the cost of money or the cost of spending for everybody. And it is for this reason that rising US Treasury yields have proven historically to mark the beginning of the end of the debt cycle and are typically followed by a recession. Finally, in episode 9, we looked at the mortgage renewal wave here in Canada. And we started off by looking at this financial stability report which the Bank of Canada released in 2024. In this report, the Bank of Canada projected that the increase in the 5-year fixed mortgage rates here in Canada upon renewal would be in the realm of 22%. And from graphing out the mortgage renewal wave, I was able to confirm that the Bank of Canada were extremely accurate with these projections. I graphed out the mortgage renewal wave here in Canada using the aggregate composite MLS HBI, or the benchmark price home here in Canada in any given month going back to January 2005. In conjunction with the 5-year fixed rate mortgage available here in Canada in any given month. Then, by placing this criteria into Excel and by spending an extra 100 to 120 hours in Excel, I was able to graph out the mortgage renewal wave here in Canada, as well as calculating and graphing out many other metrics regarding the mortgage renewal wave, which really helped me understand the mortgage renewal wave and mortgages overall much more deeply. This allowed me to graph out the mortgage renewal wave down to the very cent up until December of 2025. And then for January 2026 onwards, I was able to produce 7 different waves, which represent the mortgage renewal wave here in Canada at 7 different rate intervals between 3% and 4.5%. I then went on to explain why we've seen a surge in the mortgage renewal wave in late 2025. This is because even though the 5-year fixed rate mortgages peaked here in Canada in November of 2023, the 5-year mortgages which were being renewed at this time would have been originated in November of 2018, which was a period in time in which the fixed rate mortgage here in Canada was relatively high. And it is the interest rate differential which determines the increase or decrease in the mortgage upon renewal. It is for that reason that it is the mortgages that were originated in late 2020 and all throughout 2021 which will experience the largest percentage increases upon renewal, which will occur between October of last year and October of this year. We then see that there is a lag in the time in which we have the largest percentage increase upon renewal versus the largest dollar value increase upon renewal, with the largest dollar value increase upon renewal occurring all throughout 2026. Then there is a further lag time before we experience the largest dollar value payment overall upon renewal, which occurs in February of 2027, which will be exactly 5 years after home prices peaked here in Canada. So all of these calculations which I've been able to do is to graph out the mortgage renewal wave for the 5-year fixed mortgages here in Canada. And I do have to admit that it is outside my current Excel capabilities to graph out the mortgage renewal wave for the variable rate mortgages with variable payments as well as the variable rate mortgages with fixed payments. But we need to be very conscious of the fact that it is the variable rate mortgages with fixed payments which will experience the largest percentage increase upon renewal, and that this will occur in 2026. It is very easy to understand why this is, because these variable rate mortgages with fixed payments didn't see the size of their monthly payments increase as the Bank of Canada was ratcheting up interest rates in 2022 and 2023. Instead, the percentage of these mortgages that were going towards interest kept on increasing until it got to the point that the entire monthly payment that was being paid was going towards interest, with none going towards paying down principal. It even got to the point where the monthly payment was not only not covering principal, but it was no longer covering all the interest that was owed in the mortgage. When this happened, the unpaid interest was then tacked on to the end of the mortgage, which meant that the amount outstanding on the mortgage was actually increasing as opposed to decreasing. For this reason, the amount of time it was taking to pay off this mortgage was actually increasing as opposed to decreasing as these monthly payments were being made. And when the amount of time that it takes to pay off a mortgage is increasing, this is what we refer to as negative amortization. You'll remember these graphs from early on in this episode, where we looked at the breakdown of interest and principal in each monthly mortgage payment. And we saw that the breakdown of interest and principal is completely dependent on the interest rate at which the mortgage is originated, with the amount of principal and interest that's paid on the first monthly mortgage payment being exactly the same if the mortgage is taken out at a rate of 2.775%. However, if the mortgage interest rate is greater than 2.775%, the amount of interest will be greater than the amount of principal in the first few months or years of paying down the mortgage. And I'm sharing these graphs so we can visualize how it would have got to the point where these variable rate mortgages with fixed payments would have gotten to a point where all of the payment was going towards interest with none going towards principal. We then looked at how these variable rate mortgages with fixed payments were 4 times more popular than the variable rate mortgages with variable payments. And we mentioned that despite the fixed rate mortgages being by far the most popular mortgage type here in Canada, that for a period of time in the very low interest rates of 2021, that the variable rate mortgages became more popular than the fixed rate mortgages here in Canada. This is because the variable rate mortgages were substantially lower than the fixed rate mortgages here in Canada at that time. Finally, we looked at how mortgage rates here in Canada have been on an overall downward trajectory over the last 4 decades between the early 1980s and the early 2020s. And this, for the most part, resulted in Canadians nearly always paying less upon renewal of their mortgage. This was a massive tailwind for the real estate industry here in Canada, and would have been the number one reason why home prices here in Canada continued to go higher over this time period. And this would have been the main reason why home prices in Canada would have been in a substantial upward trajectory overall between the early 1980s and the early 2020s. There was a few blips along the way, and it was this increase in mortgage rates in the early 1990s that caused the most recent substantial downturn in the Canadian real estate market. However, the current correction in Canadian home prices that we're currently living through here in Canada has already surpassed that of the early 1990s. Finally, we looked at the main reason why the mortgage renewal wave overall is very substantial in macroeconomics. It is because this period in time in which Canadians will be renewing mortgages at higher rates and therefore higher in payments, which fits in so well with what Ray Dalio describes in this video when he describes the mechanics of how the economic machine works. In this video, and in the many books that he has written, Ray talks about a point in time in which consumers have to set aside more money to pay down existing debt, and therefore have less money to spend on goods and services and put into the real economy. Because consumers are able to put less money into the real economy, That causes a contraction in spending in the real economy, and a contraction in spending in the real economy is what leads to a recession. This once again fits in perfectly with this graph, which I've used for years to describe where we are in the economic cycle. It is very evident that interest rate hiking cycles precede recessions, because interest rate hiking cycles cause periods in time in which debt servicing costs go up, and therefore expenditure in the real economy goes down. This then causes a recession and signals the end of a debt cycle and the beginning of the next. So that's a recap of all the episodes that we did throughout 2025. And once again, I still maintain that we're focused on some of the main themes that are playing out in our Canadian as well as our global macroeconomy. And for now, my goal is, as it always is, to be positioned as best I possibly can be for 12 months that are oncoming, to be positioned as best I possibly can be for 2026. And with returns in excess of 40% in 2025, over 2.5 times that of the S&P 500, I'm certainly very happy with the return my portfolio saw last year. And I'm very well aware that I have achieved these returns in an unconventional way. They say that you should always have a diversified portfolio, but I went into 2025 with the vast majority of my portfolio positioned in physical gold. And given where I believe we are in the debt cycle, and given my outlook for both our Canadian as well as our global economy, I'm still very comfortable and happy to enter in 2026 with the majority of my portfolio still positioned in physical gold. So if you'd like to continue to follow along as we continue to follow the main themes that are playing out in our Canadian as well as our global macroeconomy, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you all again soon, hopefully.